This is just a short podcast to try and capture something important about the Four Noble Truths that we'll be doing in the module on Buddhism at the moment and in coming and recent and following weeks. Hi, I wanted to do a short podcast in relation to an aspect of Buddhist teaching that we've been looking at, or will be looking at, called the Four Noble Truths. But in line with how we've been trying to develop our thought on this module, I didn't want to merely give you an account drawing on secondary literature. I wanted to give you something based on primary texts. So firstly, however, I'd like to say, how would it have been in the past? How would, perhaps a few years ago or in many settings, you studied the Four Noble Truths? Well, traditionally, the Four Noble Truths were given in many RS classes as something a bit like this. All is dukkha, or all is suffering. So this translation of dukkha as suffering is quite common, and although, as we'll discuss in class, it isn't by all means that good a translation, but all is dukkha is sometimes given. Then the second truth, dukkha is caused by craving. Sometimes it even goes as far as saying suffering is caused by desire, and we'll see in future weeks why there's a problem with that. The third truth is given as there is a way out, the possibility of escape, otherwise it'd be really nihilistic. The possibility of an escape, nirvana, by ending craving we end dukkha. And then the fourth noble truth is the Holy Eightfold Path, right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now that's okay, but actually, is that what it says in the actual primary texts? Well, why don't we find out? And I've shown you how to access these. So if you go to our old friend accesstoinsight.org, starting place, I want to look at the Four Noble Truths. So I look in the subject index. I probably want F for 4. And then, look, there's Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's first teaching on. That looks as primary texts get. There are, as you'll see, some interesting essays on study guides as well, which you'd do well to look at. But let's go to Samyutta Nikaya 5611, which is where within the Sutta Pitaka, and the discourses of the Buddha, you'll find the first teaching. And here we are. The Dharmakakapatthana Sutta, the setting the wheel of Dharma in motion, or that sutra which sets in motion the wheel of Dharma. And what I'm going to do is look at some aspects of this, and not give a very full annotated reading, but look at it. But also it's worth noting that there are alternate translations up here. And actually I think I'm going to go for the Nanamoli translation, even though it translates dukkha as suffering, and some, as you'll see from the Harvey translation, translates it as pain erasure. Really? Pain. Painful. Okay. But I'm going to go with the Nanamoli translation. Starts, as I've said in class, virtually all the those Pali Sutras start, thus have I heard, Vamasudan, thus was heard by me. On one occasion, the Blessed One, that's the Buddha, was living at Benares in the deer park at the resort of seers, Isipatana. There he addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5. You remember those 5? The 5 he was hanging about with, that we talked about in terms of extremities of asceticism. And he says to them, which if you do recognise who they are is all the more provocative, bhikkhus, those 2 extremes ought not to be cultivated by one gone forth from the house life. What are those 2? Gone forth from the house life, sometimes rendered as gone forth from home into homelessness, i.e. a renunciant. So what two extremes should a renunciant avoid? What are the two? There is devotion to indulgence of pleasure in the objects of sensual desire, which is inferior, low, vulgar, ignoble, and leads to no good. So, the life that in the narrative account of the prince or the rich person who indulges in pleasure, as the Buddha was seen to have done in his early life, which is vulgar, inferior, leads nowhere. And there is devotion to self-torment, which is painful, ignoble, and leads to no good. So the life that these five that he's addressing have been living. So the life of extreme asceticism leads nowhere. The life of indulging your senses leads nowhere. And of course we talked a bit about this phrase, the middle way. But the middle way discovered by a perfect one, i.e. him, or a Buddha, another Buddha would be, avoids both these extremes. It gives vision, it gives knowledge, and it leads to peace, to direct acquaintance, to direct seeing, I guess, rather than having views, we've discussed in class, to discovery to nirvana, or nirvana as we know it often in English. And what is that middle way? It is simply the Noble Eightfold Path. There it is, we'll see a bit more about it. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. That is the middle way, discovered by a perfect one, which gives vision, which gives knowledge, and which leads to peace, to direct acquaintance, to discovery, to nirvana, or to nibbana. And you'll notice already the structural features of the kind of literature it is that we've discussed or will be discussing in class, as these students have these repetitive use of these certain kind of phrases. It's kind of normal. And then it goes and it gives the Four Noble Truths, or a version of them. It talks about suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So here we have the Four Noble Truths. It doesn't say, here are the Four Noble Truths. And it doesn't say, as you'll see, all is suffering the way that it often does in textbooks or other accounts. So, then it goes on to say the things about them. Suffering as a noble truth is this. So here's the primary text of the first noble truth. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow and lamentation, pain, grief and despair is suffering. Association with the loathed is suffering. Disassociation from the loved is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. Too right. In short, suffering is the 5 categories of clinging objects. That last little line, suffering is the 5 categories of clinging objects, might seem a bit more obscure. But that refers to the 5 khandhas we'll talk about elsewhere, but the 5 elements that go to make up a person and all else in conditioned reality. So it never actually quite says everything is suffering, though there's not much in there that gets to escape. So living as a human being seemed quite unpleasant. Some would put a gloss on this by saying that the description of birth, aging, sickness and all these things as suffering is as we experience them, because we've got various attachments and things and graspings. But perhaps we can come to that another time. Second noble truth, the origin of suffering. Where does suffering come from? And we saw suffering, all suffering is caused by desire. What does it say that? What does it say? It says, the origin of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is the craving that produces renewal of being, accompanied by enjoyment and lust, and enjoying this and that. In other words, craving for sensual desires, craving for being, and craving for non-being. So it is craving, but it isn't the generic word for desire, like karma or something that we find in the original, in the Pali. It's the word tanha, trishna in Sanskrit, that means something like thirsting. So it's not just desire in general, it's a particular kind of grasping, thirsting, wanting that causes suffering, that causes renewal of being reborn. And it's sensual pleasures and desires of a certain sort. It's also craving for being and craving for non-being. As I've said in class probably, Buddhism is really keen on lists. So even in this list there are sub-lists. So the second of the Four Noble Truths has a list of 3. The fourth one has a list of 8, as we know. Won't get drawn into those in detail and say craving for being is obviously, you might say, is the desire to carry on existing. It's the desire to carry on being, survival instinct. Craving for non-being. Well, we might see that in extreme forms as a desire for suicide or self-annihilation, and we know people, perhaps have known people who either drink alcohol in a way that seems they just want to obliterate their being conscious. There's something kind of a bit pathological or worrying about it. Or it might be at the root a desire to avoid things that make us uncomfortable. So it's a desire to not be present. And we can kind of perhaps get a sense of the subtle senses in which that's used. The third noble truth, cessation of suffering as a noble truth, is this. And I guess if it wasn't for this, there'd be no way out of this tough life otherwise. Cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is remainderless fading and ceasing, giving up, relinquishing, letting go and rejecting of that same craving. So, getting rid of it. Basically, if we can get rid of the craving, the desire that's that negative form, if we get rid of that craving, the dukkha, the suffering, evaporates. Now, there's much more we'll say about that elsewhere, in other contexts in class, but as a starting point, it says, if we can let go, if we can not crave in this way, not desire things in this grasping, desperate way, then the suffering that goes with it, if we're not attached to our bodies, seeing them get older isn't a problem. If I'm not attached to my body and grasping onto it, if I'm sick, well, that's the nature of things. You know, I'm not worried about those things. That's easily said and is very, very difficult, and Buddhism acknowledges, I think, in this form at least, the difficulty of this. So the Noble Truths are the way leading to cessation, the hardest word for me to say, cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is simply the Noble Eightfold Path, that is to say. Right view, right intention, these are kind of wisdom aspects of the path. Right speech, right action, right livelihood, these seem like kind of moral, ethical aspects of the path. And then right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration are meditative aspects of the path. So it's a blend, the Eightfold Path, the prescription, if you will, for the symptoms we're suffering that will lead to the cure that's been predicted in this model. You often quite hear that. You quite often hear that medical model for the Noble Truths. And so the prescription itself has a wisdom aspect, a moral aspect, and a meditative aspect. So that's quite interesting. I won't go through the rest of the things. I'd like you to read that for class, other than to say, what do you think the 5 people listening thought? But this is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus of the group of 5 were glad, and they approved his words. Now, during this utterance, there arose in the venerable Kondanda the spotless, immaculate vision of the true idea. So one of those listening got something, kind of clicked with him while he was listening. And he utters this utterance. That's what you do at utterances, you utter them. So he says something which is at the heart, really, of a lot of Buddhist teaching. Whatever is subject to arising is all subject to cessation. Sometimes put another way, whatever is of the nature to come into being is by its very nature subject to passing from being. So the Blessed One at that point sets in motion the wheel of truth, the wheel of Dharma. That's how the earth gods raise the cry. You know, there's not that kind of strict atheism in early Buddhism that we perhaps sometimes ascribe to it. There is a sense that the gods are subject to karma and rebirth, and perhaps more like us than we realise, but want to listen to the Buddha. So the earth gods cry. At Benares, in the Deer Park, Litipatana, the matchless wheel of truth has been set rolling by the Blessed One. not to be stopped by monk or divine or god or death angel or high divinity or anyone in the world. On hearing the earth god's cry, all the gods in turn in the 6 paradises of the central sphere took up the cry, till it reached the retinue of high divinity in the sphere of pure form. And so indeed in that hour, at that moment, the cry soared up to the world of high divinity. And this 10,000-fold world element shook and rocked and quaked, and a great measureless radiance surpassing the very nature of the gods was displayed in the world. Then the Blessed One uttered the exclamation, Kondanana knows, and that is how the Venerable One acquired the name Anakondananda. Kondananda, I can't say his name, and Kondanya, who knows. And I think that bit, before I screwed it up by getting his name wrong, in the penultimate paragraph there, is really kind of evocative, that all these beings, this whole hugely populated cosmos, this 10,000-fold world element, early Buddhism before sees a kind of a populated cosmos with all these different kinds of beings. The Buddha is superior to them all, it seems, in wisdom, and when he sets in motion the wheel of Dharma through his teaching, they all rock and shake and quake. So the first sermon doesn't seem just as him going on and doing metta teaching, but as something earth-shattering. This knowledge has been kind of loosed upon the world. What the answer can be to the human condition is now out, and people are understanding it. And that's the start, in a sense, at least according to these kind of textual accounts, of what we come ultimately to know as Buddhism and study. This is just a short podcast to try and capture something important about the Four Noble Truths that we'll be doing in the module on Buddhism at the moment and in coming and recent and following weeks.